I want you to close your eyes for a second. Well, assuming you aren't behind the wheel, obviously.
Right, yeah. Definitely keep them open if you're driving.
Exactly. But if you're sitting at home, I want you to mentally transport yourself into a jungle.
And not just a mild forest. We are talking about a dense, heavy jungle.
Oh, man, yeah. The air is so thick, like so heavy with monsoon humidity, that every single breath feels like you are practically drinking the atmosphere.
It's that oppressive kind of heat. Yeah.
Totally. And it's twilight. So the cicadas are creating this deafening mechanical roar all around you.
Just that constant vibrating hum in your ears.
Right. And the broad leaves of the canopy up above, they're still dripping from a recent torrential downpour.
Yeah.
Everything around you is just this chaotic, impenetrable tangle of green and brown shadows.
It's an environment where you really can't see past your own outstretched hand.
Exactly. Now, somewhere in that dense, suffocating brush, maybe less than 50 feet away from where you're standing, is a 250-kilogram apex predator.
Which is just a staggering amount of animal.
It's over 500 pounds of pure, coiled muscle. I mean, we're talking about an animal equipped with paws the size of dinner plates.
And claws like steel hooks.
Yes, and jaws that have been engineered by evolution to crush vertebrae with this effortless, terrifying grace.
But here is the truly chilling part of that whole scenario. You cannot hear it.
You cannot see it.
Right. This creature is essentially a phantom.
It has been sculpted by, millions of years of brutal, unforgiving natural selection to be the ultimate solitary killer.
It is completely invisible, totally silent, and crucially, it works alone.
Always alone. That is the fundamental, unbroken rule of this entire ecosystem.
Or, well, it's supposed to be.
Right. Because that brings us to the core of what we're talking about today. What happens when nature abruptly decides to just, violate its own unbreakable laws?
It's the kind of thing that genuinely keeps biologists awake at night.
Because what if, instead of one giant solitary assassin stalking through the darkness, you are surrounded by 4 of them?
Oh, it's a nightmare scenario.
And what if these 4 massive animals are not just miraculously tolerating one another's presence, but they have actively fused into a highly organized tactical squad?
I mean, it is the exact scenario that shatters everything we thought we knew.
Yeah.
We operate under this assumption that we understand the foundational programming of the natural world, right?
Sure, like the rules are set in stone.
Exactly. Especially when we are dealing with apex predators at the absolute top of the food chain. Their behavioral rules are supposed to be written in genetic stone.
But when those ancient rules shatter, the consequences are immediate.
Oh, they are extraordinarily violent.
Yeah, and they send shockwaves through the entire architecture of the ecosystem. So, welcome to today's deep dive. Today, we are unpacking this truly extraordinary report from a source called Apex Truth.
And this is not going to be a dry biology lecture, just to be clear.
No, not at all. We are venturing deep into the heart of India, into an environment where ancient human history and raw, unchecked biological power just kind of violently intersect.
We are treating this material like the premium wildlife thriller it actually is.
Because we are exploring a recent wildlife anomaly that completely defied every established scientific model.
And it very nearly triggered the total collapse of an ancient, thriving ecosystem.
Right, because if you are biologically locked into being a solitary sniper, you have to ask, what physically has to break in your brain to allow 4 of you to form an alliance?
Well, to really understand the sheer magnitude of that biological malfunction, I think we first have to understand the theater where this all played out.
Let's set the stage.
So, the Apex Truth Report centers on Bandhavgarh National Park. This is located in the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh.
And we should clarify, this is not some manicured, fenced-in little nature reserve. Right?
Oh, definitely not. This is a sprawling, rugged kingdom. It's massive. And right in the very center of this vast expanse, literally rising out of the jungle, is this huge escarpment topped with the ruins of a 1,000-year-old fort.
That imagery is just incredible. The stone walls and these ancient temples have literally been swallowed whole by the massive, twisting root systems of ancient fig trees.
It's a landscape that genuinely feels completely lost to time.
The sensory details in the report are just wild. It describes the atmosphere as almost physically oppressive if your body isn't used to it.
Yeah, you have this heavy monsoon humidity just physically pressing down on your chest.
And the air is saturated with the sweet, almost intoxicating resinous scent of sal trees.
And the terrain itself, it's a very complex mosaic.
Right, because you have these sprawling patches of closed canopy jungle where barely any sunlight even reaches the forest floor.
It's perpetually dark in there.
Yeah, and then without warning, the tree line just breaks into these wide, dry, golden clearings.
You call them bamaras.
Okay, bamaras. So it is an environment of extreme contrast, and stalking through this highly specific, highly demanding terrain is the undisputed architect of the whole ecosystem.
The Bengal tiger.
The Bengal tiger? And I mean, the Bengal tiger is just an absolute marvel example of evolutionary engineering.
Oh, without a doubt.
Right.
We are talking about the largest and heaviest living feline species on the planet today.
A single adult male is basically a solitary emperor.
Yeah, he commands a massive home range. We're talking anywhere from 50 to well over 100 square kilometers, depending on the prey density in the area.
That is a huge amount of real estate for one animal to control.
It is, and he defends that real estate with a ferocity that is honestly difficult to overstate.
He's constantly on the move, right?
He is in a state of constant restless motion. He's always patrolling the borders of his territory, meticulously marking the perimeter with his pheromone-laced urine.
And the vocalizations, too.
Yes, he projects these deep, low-frequency vocalizations, these roars that literally vibrate through the dense understory.
It's like a physical force.
It really is. And every single scent mark, every acoustic signal, is a clear, unambiguous warning broadcast to any rival male.
Basically saying, if you cross this invisible line, it guarantees a fight to the death.
Exactly. Which brings us to the core biological mandate that makes this whole story so completely baffling.
Tigers hunt alone.
They have to.
Right. It isn't a lifestyle choice. Like, they just prefer their alone time. It is a rigid mandate dictated by the literal laws of physics and thermodynamics.
You really have to look at the caloric math here.
Okay, let's break that down. You have an animal that weighs 1/4 of a ton.
Right.
The metabolic furnace required just to keep that massive biological engine running, to fuel the muscles and maintain body temperature, it demands an astronomical amount of protein.
It's a huge energetic cost.
So if a tiger had to divide the meat from a single kill with 3 or 4 other full-grown adults, the math just completely falls apart.
They would burn more calories hunting than they would actually consume.
They would literally starve.
Exactly. The math simply does not support a pack structure for an animal that big in that environment. But beyond just the caloric requirements, there is the physics of acoustic stealth.
This is where it gets really interesting.
If you contrast a tiger with a lion, for example, lions evolved on the open savannas of Africa.
Right, wide open spaces.
Yeah, their environment is vast, visibility stretches for miles, and their primary prey consists of massive herds of ungulates.
So for a lion, hunting in a pride and utilizing coordinated, group tactics in the open makes perfect evolutionary sense.
Exactly. You need multiple bodies to bring down a huge buffalo in broad daylight.
But a tiger is optimized for the exact opposite theater of war.
A tiger is designed for the closed jungle.
They are ambush predators.
Precisely. They are built for explosive, short-distance, high-velocity ambushes in environments where visibility might be like less than 10 feet.
Wow, less than 10 feet.
Yeah, so their entire physiology is engineered for solitary stealth. The vertical black stripes, they act as disruptive coloration.
Breaking up their silhouette against the tall grass and the bamboo shadows.
Right. And the physical structure of their paws, they have these thick, soft digital pads that allow them to place 1/4 of a ton of weight onto a bed of dry teak leaves in absolute silence.
It's so crazy to think about. It really brings up this elite sniper analogy.
You know, it's a perfect analogy.
Like, if you are a sniper deep behind enemy lines, your survival depends entirely on going completely unnoticed.
You can't make a sound.
Right. You move millimeters at a time, you blend into the foliage, you take one perfect calculated shot, and then you just vanish.
Exactly.
Now, imagine you are that solitary sniper, and military command suddenly drops 3 more snipers right into your nest and orders you to move as a unit.
It completely destroys your tactical advantage.
Totally. Because 4 massive bodies are going to snap 4 times as many twigs, they're going to displace 4 times as much brush, and they're going to leave an olfactory footprint that every single sandbar deer within a 2-mile radius is going to detect.
It's an operational disaster. Moving a 250-kilogram cat silently is already a miracle of biomechanics.
But moving 1,000 kilograms of combined tiger silently, that should be impossible.
It absolutely should be. And that rigid, unforgiving biological reality is exactly what makes the events of 2023 in Bandhavgarh not just an oddity, but a mathematically terrifying systemic failure.
Because nature is usually this hyper-refined system of algorithms, right? Honed over millions of years of trial and error.
Yeah, and what occurred in this jungle was a catastrophic breach of that protocol.
Okay, so how does the system actually break? Take us to the start of the anomaly.
So the year is 2023. According to the Apex Truth Report, on the remote margins of the park, there is this legendary litter of 4 young male tigers.
And their brothers.
Yes, 4 brothers. And they reach the critical age of 2. Now, in feline biology, 24 months is basically biological midnight.
It's the age of dispersion.
Exactly. Dispersion is this fascinating and honestly highly volatile physiological process.
What exactly happens in their bodies at that point?
Well, when these young males hit that 2-year mark, their endocrine systems undergo a massive transformation. Their testosterone levels just spike dramatically.
Okay.
And this hormonal flood fundamentally rewires their brains, specifically how their olfactory bulbs process scent.
Oh, wow. So they actually smell things differently?
Yes. Up until this point, the scent of their brothers registered as family. Provided comfort and a sense of security.
But then the testosterone hits.
Right, as that testosterone surges, the brain begins to reinterpret that exact same pheromone signature as a rival.
That is why.
It triggers a stress response, the amygdala fires up, aggression builds, and they are biologically compelled to view each other as mortal threats.
So they're supposed to violently reject one another.
Yeah, and scatter to the four winds to carve out their own solitary empires.
But they didn't.
No, they do.
They completely ignored millions of years of hardwired genetic programming. I mean, they didn't just casually delay their separation for a few weeks, they solidified their bond.
They stayed together, forming an active, coordinated coalition of nearly 800 kilograms of pure, lethal muscle.
Which is just terrifying to think about. And when the first reports started trickling in about this, the reaction from the scientific community was just complete denial. Right?
Total denial. The source notes that the initial sightings came from the mahouts, the highly experienced local safari guides who navigate the jungle on elephant back.
Right.
And also from the villagers living in the park's periphery.
They were coming back with these wild stories of seeing 4 massive tigers walking shoulder to shoulder down the dirt tracks.
And the park officials just completely dismissed it.
They dismissed it entirely. It was chalked up to exaggeration or a trick of the monsoon light or just campfire folklore.
But you can't really blame the biologists for their skepticism, can you?
Not really. I mean, human science has historically suffered from a certain degree of anthropocentrism. We tend to project our own rigid binaries onto the natural world.
Like putting things in neat little boxes. Exactly. We categorize an animal as either strictly solitary or strictly social, and we really resist any evidence that suggests a fluid spectrum.
So to a tiger biologist, 4 adult males hunting together is basically as absurd as suggesting a great white shark is suddenly flying.
It sounds like science fiction.
Oh.
But the rumors persisted, and eventually, the forestry department had to dispatch armed patrols to actually verify the claims.
Imagine the sheer psychological tension of being on one of those foot patrols.
I can't even imagine.
You are hiking into the dense, humid undergrowth, armed with a rifle, looking for tracks in the soft mud.
And your entire training is based on tracking a solitary animal.
Right. You expect to find one set of overlapping pug marks, but instead you push through the bamboo and you find the mud churned up by 4 distinct, massive sets of tracks.
All moving in the exact same direction.
At the exact same pace. It fundamentally changes the entire threat assessment.
It does. And the patrols visually confirmed it. 800 kilograms of apex predator moving through the jungle, not just as a loose aggregation of individuals who happen to be near each other, but as a synchronized unit.
Now, shortly after this confirmation, one of the 4 brothers did eventually succumb to his biological imperative, right?
Yeah, his testosterone threshold likely triggered earlier or maybe just more intensely, and he split off. He vanished into the forest to establish his own territory.
But that departure left a core trio. And rather than that departure breaking the spell, those remaining 3 bonded even tighter.
They did.
And having 3 giant tigers operating as a cohesive unit isn't just some heartwarming, Disney story about brotherly love.
Oh, far from it.
It instantly and very violently altered the power dynamics of the entire jungle. Because they weren't just surviving, they were strategizing.
And they set their sights on a completely different tier of the ecosystem's hierarchy.
Right, so let's talk about that. In a healthy, balanced ecosystem, a solitary tiger governs the forest floor.
But there is always a secondary predator occupying a slightly different ecological niche.
And in Bandhavgarh, that secondary predator is the Indian leopard.
Yeah, the Apex Truth Report refers to them as the acrobats of the canopy.
Which is such a great phrase. Leopards are phenomenally adaptable, but they are significantly smaller and lighter than tigers.
They survive in tiger territory strictly through a strategy of extreme stealth and evasion. They completely understand the weight disparity.
A leopard knows a physical confrontation with a tiger is basically a death sentence.
Right, so they utilize the verticality of the jungle, they stick to the shadows, and they use the ancient trees as a sanctuary.
They exist in the margins, playing this constant high-stakes game of hide-and-seek with the king.
But because this trio of tigers had rewritten the rules of engagement, the leopards were operating on outdated software.
They had no idea the game had changed.
None at all.
And the Apex Truth Report details a specific, absolutely horrifying eyewitness account from local villagers that perfectly illustrates this.
This account is chilling.
It happened at 3 p.m., right in the middle of the afternoon. A young leopard was walking carefully along the edge of a muddy stream.
It was executing its survival strategy perfectly, too.
Right, its coat, covered in those dark rosettes, provided flawless camouflage against the dappled light of the tall grass. It was moving silently, completely unaware that it had just walked into a trap.
The mechanics of the specific encounter are what truly terrified the biologists who analyzed the report.
Because this wasn't just 3 tigers spotting a leopard and giving chase in some chaotic free-for-all.
No, to pull off what they did requires complex, silent communication and, honestly, spatial mapping.
So how do tigers coordinate and maneuver without speaking? Because they obviously don't use vocalizations when hunting. That would give away their position immediately.
Right. Instead, they rely on very subtle visual cues. Tigers have these distinct white spots on the back of their ears called ocelli.
Oh, I've seen those in pictures.
Yeah. In the dense brush, flattening their ears and flashing those white spots can act as a visual beacon to another tiger behind them.
That is so smart.
They also use minute tail twitches and intense eye contact to synchronize their movements.
So the villagers are watching this unfold from a high ridge. They see the three massive tigers actively coordinating. They don't just rush the leopard blindly.
They flank it.
They spread out, moving through the dry brush without making a single sound, and they deliberately position themselves to cut off the leopard's only escape route to the heavy timber.
They actually anticipated the leopard's hardwired defense mechanism, which is running up a tree, and they intentionally neutralized that vertical advantage before they even initiated the strike.
It is just a stunning display of predatory intelligence.
It really is. By the time the wind shifted and the leopard caught the heavy, musky scent of the tigers,
By the time the adrenaline dumped into its system and it realized it was surrounded,
the visible chess match was already over. The trap just snapped shut.
the leopard was crushed in a matter of seconds by an overwhelming synchronized force. And the villagers who witnessed this backed away in absolute silence, realizing that the forest had fallen under the control of a new, highly tactical regime.
Now, this is where I think we have to pause and ask a question that fundamentally challenges this whole scenario.
Okay, what's that?
Aren't predators intrinsically lazy?
Ah, yes! Because biological efficiency is the law of the land.
Right. A predator wants the maximum caloric return for the minimum expenditure of energy and risk. A fight with another apex predator is an incredibly dangerous gamble.
Because a leopard might be smaller, but it is entirely composed of fast twitch muscle, razor-sharp claws, and teeth designed to tear flesh.
Exactly. One lucky, desperate swipe from a dying leopard to a tiger's eye, or a deep bite to a joint, and that tiger's ability to hunt is permanently compromised.
And in the wild, an injury like that means a slow, agonizing death by starvation.
So why would three massive tigers risk permanent injury to fight a lethal leopard when they could just ambush a chital deer with almost zero risk?
That is the crucial question, and the answer is what shifted this from a behavioral oddity to a full-blown ecological crisis.
Because this was not a hunt for calories.
Right, the tigers were not eating these leopards out of starvation. The meat was completely incidental.
What the Apex Truth Report reveals is that these brothers, whom the locals actually began calling Teen Hathiyar, which translates to the three killers, they were engaged in a calculated strategy of hyperpredation.
They were waging a territorial war.
They weren't hunting, they were establishing a monopoly.
Because maintaining an empire requires absolute control over resources.
Exactly. As a trio, their caloric demands were just staggering, and they seemed to intuitively recognize that to sustain their coalition long-term, they could not afford to share the prey base with any other predator.
So they systematically cleared the board.
They hunted down and eradicated anything with fangs and claws that might compete with them for a single calorie of meat.
It was an organized campaign of extermination. That is a terrifying level of foresight for an animal.
It truly is.
And this campaign of extermination did not happen in a vacuum. By systematically removing the secondary predators, the Teen Hathiyar triggered a catastrophic chain reaction throughout the entire park.
A phenomenon ecologists call a trophic cascade.
Let's break down exactly how this happens mechanically, because it's fascinating.
Well, you can think of a trophic cascade kind of like a massive, precarious game of Jenga. Ecosystems are built on a very delicate equilibrium of pressure.
Okay, so the top predators, the tigers, they apply downward pressure on the secondary predators, the leopards, and the large herbivores.
Right, and the secondary predators apply pressure to the middle tier of herbivores.
And those herbivores apply pressure to the bottom tier, the vegetation, and the soil.
Exactly. So when you violently remove one of those middle blocks, the entire tower begins to collapse in on itself. This is the fundamental difference between top-down and bottom-up regulation.
And the effects were seen almost immediately. The forestry department's desks were suddenly inundated with reports of gutted leopard carcasses.
The elusive leopards practically vanished overnight. They became ghosts in their own forest.
The report highlights a specific turning point involving two adult male leopards named Kali and Raja.
Yeah, researchers were monitoring them using GPS telemetrics.
Let's briefly explain how that works for people who might not know.
Yeah.
These collars use a combination of VHF radio signals and GPS satellites to ping the animal's location.
But crucially, they also contain accelerometers.
Right, so if the collar doesn't detect movement for a set period of time, it actually shifts its signal frequency.
It transmits a mortality signal.
Wow.
It is a very specific, rapid pulse that tells the researchers the animal is dead.
And when the trackers received those mortality signals for both Kali and Raja, armed guards hiked into the coordinates.
And they didn't find animals that died of natural causes.
No, they found brutal crime scenes. Tufts of spotted fur scatter across the thick bamboo stalks snapped cleanly in half from the sheer kinetic violence of the struggle.
And deep, giant tiger pug marks pressed heavily into the blood-soaked mud.
With the leopards either wiped off the map or driven into very deep hiding, a vital ecological function simply vanished.
Because leopards hunt a very different prey profile than tigers.
Right, they focus on the smaller, highly agile targets like the macaques in the trees or the medium-sized chital deer.
They act as a constant nocturnal pressure on those populations.
But with the leopards gone, those smaller herbivores suddenly found themselves living in a predator-free utopia. They literally lost their fear.
And herbivores, when they are devoid of predatory pressure, they do one thing extremely well.
They multiply.
They multiply rapidly. The populations of macaques and chital deer just exploded. Huge herds began moving through the forest with absolute impunity.
They stopped spending energy looking over their shoulders and dedicated all their time to foraging.
And the sheer volume of these animals began to fundamentally alter the botany of the park.
The physical destruction is staggering to think about. These massive herds stripped all the new shoots from the sal trees. They aggressively consumed the underbrush, devouring the seedlings before they could even establish root systems.
And sal forests rely on a very specific cycle of regeneration. By eating the understory down to the dirt, the herbivores were destroying the root networks that hold the topsoil together.
The forest was losing its ability to regenerate its own architecture.
It is incredibly reminiscent of the famous ecological collapse in Yellowstone National Park before wolves were reintroduced.
Oh, that's a perfect comparison.
Yeah, the elk populations there exploded. They grazed the willow and aspen saplings down to the nub, which then destroyed the habitats for songbirds and beavers, which subsequently altered the physical flow of the rivers.
It's all connected, and in Bandhavgarh, the tigers broke the apex of the food chain, which caused the middle tier to hyperinflate, which subsequently caused the foundational tier, the vegetation, to be systematically erased.
In a matter of mere months, this ancient, sprawling biosphere was teetering on the edge of irreparable collapse.
Try to visualize this dying forest for a second. The towering, majestic, ancient sal trees are still standing, providing this grand canopy.
But the ground level, the dense, chaotic underbrush that actually makes a jungle function as a jungle, is just gone.
It is being transformed into a barren, heavily grazed landscape, just swarming with fearless deer. All because 3 tigers decided to ignore their genetic code and hunt together.
And the speed of this collapse absolutely panicked the humans who managed the park. It led to a massive crisis of philosophy.
Because the forestry department in India operates under a strictly hands-off conservation philosophy normally.
Right, the golden rule is usually to let nature dictate its own terms. Because human interference, even with the best intentions, often creates unforeseen secondary disasters.
But the magnitude and the velocity of the calamity unfolding in Bandhavgarh shattered every existing protocol.
The conservation executives actually convened emergency crisis meetings.
They stared at the data and realized that if they maintained their hands-off approach, the park's botanical foundation would be permanently destroyed.
They felt they had to step in and artificially rebalance the scales.
And the intervention plan they drafted sounds like a military black ops mission.
It really does.
They decided to deploy dozens of new, heavily armed patrol teams. They brought in specialized kumquis.
Those are highly trained elephants, right?
Exactly, because moving vehicles through the dense brush was just too loud and too dangerous.
So they established a complex surveillance network of camera traps, specifically placed at geographical bottlenecks, like narrow ravines, to map the exact daily movements of the 3 brothers.
And the ultimate objective of all this preparation. Veterinarians were going to ride these elephants into the jungle, track down an 800-kilogram, highly intelligent, tactical death squad, use chemical darts to forcibly anesthetize all 3 of them simultaneously, and then physically airlift them to opposite extreme corners of the reserve.
Just to artificially shatter their coalition. The logistics of that plan are a complete nightmare.
I mean, the pharmacology alone is terrifying.
You are attempting to calculate the exact dosage of a ketamine and xylazine cocktail needed to safely sedate a 250-kilogram animal whose system is completely flooded with adrenaline.
If the dart hits bone and doesn't fully inject, or if the dosage is even slightly off, you don't have a sleeping tiger.
No, you have an enraged, disoriented, semi-drugged apex predator hiding in thick brush.
Which is the most dangerous thing imaginable. Furthermore, you have to dart all 3 almost simultaneously.
Because if you drop one, the other 2 might perceive the elephants as the threat and launch a coordinated attack.
It was an operation fraught with catastrophic risk to human, elephant, and tiger life.
Which really brings up a profound philosophical dilemma.
Let's talk about that, because this is where it gets deep. If this behavior, as wildly unprecedented and destructive as it was entirely naturally occurring.
Right, like no human pollution or habitat loss forced these tigers to team up.
Exactly. should humans intervene to stop it. At what point does preserving the flora of a park, the trees and the bushes, justify traumatizing, drugging, and forcibly separating three wild brothers who simply figured out a highly successful evolutionary loophole?
Are we preserving nature as it wants to evolve, or are we just preserving a static museum diorama version of nature that we feel comfortable with?
That is the ultimate paradox of modern conservation.
We draw these arbitrary lines around what we define as a healthy ecosystem. When nature suddenly deviates from our rigid blueprint, our immediate arrogant instinct is to fix it.
But are we correcting a glitch, or are we actively suppressing evolution happening in real time?
Perhaps this coalition behavior was a rudimentary evolutionary adaptation, a preview of how tigers might survive in a changing world.
But from the perspective of the park managers who are watching the soil erode and the saplings literally vanish, they didn't have the luxury of waiting 50 years to observe the evolutionary outcome.
Right, the house was on fire right in front of them.
So the human teams loaded their tranquilizer darts. The mahouts readied the elephants. The entire forestry department was holding its collective breath, prepared to execute this highly volatile mission.
And then
the absolute most massive plot twist in the entire story occurred.
the jungle intervened.
It solved its own crisis, literally days before the human operation was given the green light.
The very week the intervention teams were scheduled to deploy, the Teen Hathiyar coalition spontaneously dissolved.
And the catalyst wasn't human interference, it wasn't a lack of prey, and it certainly wasn't a defeat by an outside rival.
No, it was something far older and far more powerful than any tactical alliance.
It was their own inescapable biology.
The testosterone override.
Precisely. While they were young, the novelty and the sheer power of their coalition sustained them.
But as they crossed the threshold into full mature adulthood, the chemical composition of their bodies shifted violently.
The ancient hardwired instinct to find reproducing females, to secure mating rights and pass on their genetic material, it finally overwhelmed the fraternal bond.
The biological imperative to reproduce is arguably the single most powerful force in the natural world.
It flooded their systems with cortisol and reproductive hormones.
They possessed the cognitive intelligence to invent a completely new hunting paradigm, but they could not outthink their own endocrine systems.
It's amazing. And the Apex Truth Report describes the dissolution of the squad in a way that is almost poetic.
It wasn't a violent implosion at all.
They didn't succumb to a blood-soaked battle for dominance. They just looked at one another, realized that the territorial war was won, that the empire was secured, and they peacefully, mutually parted ways.
They divided the kingdom they had conquered, and they partitioned it flawlessly.
It stands in such stark contrast to the brutal campaign of extermination they had just concluded.
They transitioned from a military squad to diplomats negotiating a treaty.
One brother marched off to claim the dry, rugged northern mountains and valleys.
The second brother took dominion over the central plains, establishing control over an area dense with wild boars.
And the third brother, who was the largest and heaviest of the trio, pushed deep into the southern swamps, claiming the only territory capable of supporting the massive wild-water buffalo he preferred to hunt.
Instantly, the crushing pressure on the ecosystem lifted.
It was as if a massive valve had been opened.
Yeah.
With the tigers dispersed to the absolute furthest corners of the park, the surviving leopards, analyzing the sudden absence of overlapping scent marks, realized the occupation was over.
They descended from the ancient fig trees under the cover of darkness.
They returned to their ancestral ecological niche, aggressively hunting the overpopulated macaques and chital deer.
The herbivore population was rapidly checked.
The sow shoots and seedlings were allowed to root and grow once more.
Balance was restored, the trophic cascade was reversed, and nature basically corrected its own terrifying error at the absolute 11th hour.
It is a phenomenal demonstration of the extreme elasticity of these ecosystems.
The balance of nature isn't some fragile static painting. It is a highly dynamic, constantly fluctuating equilibrium.
The system experienced a massive, unprecedented shock. It absorbed the damage and eventually stabilized itself, driven entirely by the invisible hand of chemistry and instinct.
It really feels like the documentary should just roll credits right there.
Right. The crisis is averted, human arrogance is humbled, and the ancient balance is restored. Fade to black.
But
the jungle had one final, baffling secret left to reveal, something that completely upends our fundamental understanding of these animals.
And this is the section of the source material that required me to reread it, like 3 times.
It truly shatters the rigid, binary assumptions we hold about animal cognition and emotional capacity.
According to decades of established behavioral literature, once male tigers separate and establish their own sovereign territories, they become permanent lethal enemies.
The biological mandate dictates that if one male crosses into another's territory, regardless of whether they are brothers, the result is a violent territorial clash.
The instinct to defend resources is supposed to override any memory of a past relationship.
But not for the Teen Hathiyar. Defying every textbook, every accepted rule of feline biology, these three brothers refuse to become permanent enemies.
The Apex Truth Report reveals that even today, years after their separation, they periodically reunite.
Which is mind-blowing. They have somehow mapped out these rare, unclaimed boundary lines deep in the jungle.
Neutral zones where their massive territories converge, but crucially do not overlap.
The camera trap data capturing these reunions is almost impossible to reconcile with everything we supposedly know about Bengal tigers.
They are photographed resting peacefully together in muddy waterholes, like old war veterans reminiscing in a localized truce.
They have even been observed engaging in brief, spontaneous, collaborative hunts near these borders.
They physically touch each other, they sleep side by side in the mud to reinforce their fraternal bond.
And then, when the brief truce concludes, they wake up, shake the mud from their coats, turn their backs and walk away, returning to their solitary domains as supreme, isolated emperors.
The cognitive dissonance of that is just staggering.
How does an animal capable of such violent, uncompromising territorialism also possess the capacity for temporary, negotiated diplomacy?
How do they even map these neutral zones?
Right. Are they utilizing highly complex scent marking? Perhaps leaving urine that lacks the aggressive testosterone markers when they approach the mud hole, signaling, hey, I'm not here to challenge you.
It implies they possess a shared cognitive map of the park's topography and a memory of their bond that supersedes their immediate instincts.
It suggests that the supposedly solitary nature of these animals might be a fluid behavioral choice dictated by efficiency, rather than a rigid, hardwired inability to be social.
When the circumstances of their youth required a tactical advantage, they constructed a complex social structure.
And when their mature biology demanded reproduction, they dissolved that structure.
But they retained the emotional or cognitive memory of their alliance.
It proves that the tapestry of wildlife survival is woven with threads of intelligence, memory, and cooperation that are vastly deeper and more complex than human science has historically given them credit for.
We have drastically underestimated their inner lives.
Let's take a breath and recap the sheer scale of the journey we just went on.
We covered a lot of ground.
We started with the biological anomaly of 4 apex predators forming an 800-kilogram tactical squad.
We watched them execute a calculated strategic war of extermination against the leopards of Bandhavgarh.
We analyzed the terrifying mechanics of a trophic cascade that nearly erased the park's entire botanical foundation.
We witnessed the panic of a desperate, aborted human intervention, followed by a flawless natural resolution driven by ancient endocrinology.
And finally, we uncovered the existence of diplomatic neutral zones and veteran reunions that defy every rule of feline behavior.
It is a profound, humbling reminder of how intricately connected and delicately balanced the natural systems around us truly are.
A single localized behavioral shift at the very apex of the food chain, just 3 animals deciding to walk in unison rather than apart, can rewrite the physical chemistry of the soil and dictate the survival of trees miles away.
It fundamentally reshapes how we observe the natural world.
And it leaves me with one final, lingering mystery for you to chew on long after this is over.
Oh, I like this.
If an animal as famously violently hardwired for absolute isolation as the Bengal tiger can temporarily invent a highly complex, tactical social structure to monopolize its environment and then peacefully negotiate its own disassembly while maintaining a lifelong diplomatic truce,
Yeah.
what other supposedly solitary animals out there are doing exactly the same thing?
Wow.
Maybe even the ones lurking in the shadows of our own backyards, secretly engaging in deep, complex social cooperation the very second we stop looking.
That is a spooky thought.
Think about that the next time you see a lone predator walking in the twilight. See you on the next deep dive.